Hey everyone, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and today I want to talk to you about the Bf 109 and firepower. Specifically, we're going to have a look at a file that I found at the German Military Archive in Freiburg, Germany, which gives us an insight into some of the testing the Germans conducted in trying to find ways to up-arm the Bf 109 with gun pods, and what the results of that were. As always, if you've been watching the channel for some time, you know that, well, I cannot actually show you the original file because photographs of this file are not classed as being in the public domain, but I can quote from it, so we shall do just that. Specifically, the file we are going to have a look at today is from Luftflotte 3. It's one of the air armies, or rather air fleets, and this one operated over occupied France and the Low Countries. They have been testing ways to substitute the two wing-mounted 20mm gun pods, some of you might be familiar with those, with an alternative that have less of an effect on the aircraft's performance. Specifically, here they are looking at a new centerline mounted gun pod, which some of you might not even know existed. So let's check it out. The strengthening of the Bf 109G force weaponry via two gun pods under the wing of course decreases the performance, especially at altitude. Luftflotte 3 tested the addition of an MG 151-20 under the fuselage behind the oil cooler. To do this, the wing gun pods of the Me 163 were used. Again, sadly, I can't show you the pictures that actually came with the file, but I have found a picture on the internet showing exactly this centerline mounting with the gun. Here we have it. So you can see how the gun is installed in the same spot that the Bf 109 would sometimes slug around a bomb when it was set up as a Jabo, a Jagdbomber, a fighter bomber, between the gear and of course below the oil cooler. Obviously it is synchronized since it fires through the propeller arc, and it had 80 rounds. The Germans decided that they would make one more change, and that is to delete the two MG17s sitting above the engine and thus save on weight and also to close off the space. And this was of course done to compensate for the extra pod. They flew the aircraft like this, just with one centerline pod, and then also once with a centerline pod and the two wing pods installed as well. And what they wanted to look at is, well, the performance loss in terms of speed to a clean Gustav, that's of course the G model, and also, the performance loss in terms of rate of climb, and of course a clean speed comparison as well as comparing the flight characteristics. So we will go through that one by one. A speed loss with a centerline pod alone is 8 km per hour, and with all three pods 28 km per hour. Nice little table here. We can see that the rate of climb is significantly reduced by the three pod setup, by 2 full minutes to 8 km of altitude, and that only gets worse the higher you go. This was done at the same climbing speed for both aircraft, but I don't know which one. Both values are a lot higher than a normal clean Bf 109 without pods. What I think happened is that the tests were conducted by mirroring operational conditions, because on the following pages it says that a different climb rate test was flown in the formation's operational flown climbing speed. The climbing times are thus not absolute values, but to be seen as comparison values between each other. So if some of you familiar with Bf 109 performance figures were scratching your heads at these numbers, now you know why. Anyway, you can see that of course to maintain the same speed, the three pod setup climbs in a much shallower climb than the one pod configuration. And I don't think this comes as a surprise, that makes perfect sense. A speed comparison between the two setups, we can see that the centerline pod achieves a 25 km per hour higher speed than a three pod setup. VA is maneuvering speed, by the way, and not top speed. By the way, if you see any minor variance in these numbers, they are within that sort of acceptable margin of error that all of these tests operate in. Based on these things, we can already see that the Bf 109 suffers from flying with these pods. But what about the flying characteristics? You might even have seen a previous video I made, also with files from the German military archive, where I talk briefly about how gun pods influence the plane's flying behavior, right? The jogging analogy, if you remember that. Here is one time period fitting description that might make more sense than my own analogy. At an altitude of 10.35 kilometers, the slats extended during a straight climb and full throttle with manual adjustment to 2,800 RPM, and the plane was barely able to fly gentle curves. Okay, this is at above 10 kilometers. Not all missions will take you there. Generally, you work between 6 to 9 kilometers when you are taking on US bombers, but this is a good example of how much your plane suffers from these pods. What conclusions did the Germans draw from this? Well, based on this experience, Luftflotte 3 makes the following demands for the Gustav series of Bf 109. Equipping the Bf 109 G3 as a high-altitude fighter with Centerline MG151-20 pod and without MG17. The Centerline pod can be forgone when equipping the Bf 109 G5. Equipping the Bf 109 G4 and G6 as a general fighter with Centerline MG151-20 pod so that it can do without the wing pods due to their worse performance and flight characteristic. Such demands were easily made, but they're very hard to meet. Now, 100 of these pods could be made available relatively quickly because they already existed. They were not built for the Bf 109, but for the Me 163. I don't have a picture of them, but I can share what War Thunder has. It is these pods right here, slightly modified at the base to fit, of course, and again refitted ETC. Those are sort of the bomb carriers that the Bf 109 is used. In this fashion, it could be mounted in a Centerline position. In the end, none of this happened. There are a few reasons why this could be, from a production over to a technical over to a tactical perspective. For production, let's start with that. You need to build these pods. Yes, of course, like I said, you have 100 pre-built that you could modify, but even the file states that craftsmen are required for this. Beyond that, you'd have to shift to a new production run of these Centerline pods that are different to the wing pods that you're already producing. Doable, but again, just will take some time, right? These pods would have to be changed as well. As the file even states itself, when equipping in series, the following elements are to be considered. For example, the relocating of the electrical equipment outside of the pod, the strengthening of the cartridge feed, and so on. It is also recommended that the engine-mounted MG151-20 switches to electrically primed ammunition to prevent confusion when rearming the two MG151-20s. That last point is interesting because it shows that difference in perspective, perhaps, on these things. Someone using these weapons in the field could, well, say, yeah, we need the same ammo for all our MG151-20s because that prevents mistakes. However, someone looking at this from a logistical or even a production standpoint would say, well, ideally we all have one type of ammo because that's just more efficient for production, rather than producing the same shell essentially twice, once electrically primed and the other one with your good old percussion priming. However, German produced both anyway. The centrally mounted engine cannon on the Bf 109 was, you've guessed it, percussion primed. The MG151-20s firing through the propeller arc in this new Centerline pod was electrically primed. You will find the same guns on the FW190s. The guns in the outer pods, however, which did not need to be synchronized, were nevertheless electrically primed as well, which is in a way indicates that the men on the ground should already be sort of used to the difference in ammo. The easiest thing, of course, on paper would be to get rid of the percussion version, but that sort of happens anyway, for a different reason. And that is the reason why I think, this is my hypothesis, the paper doesn't actually specify this, why none of this happens in the end, why the Centerline pod does not become used. The Bf-109 moves on to the Mk-108 as the Motorkanone. Yes, sometimes the MG151-20 is retained, but with the G6, the Mk-108, Mk-108 becomes the standard. And with the G6 coming out within a month of this document being made, yeah, you can see the issue there. So maybe because the plane has now received a firepower upgrade, also in the form, of course, of 2 additional MG141s instead of the MG117s, that a clean Bf-109 G6 would have the same firepower as a G4 with 2 MG151-20s, one firing through the engine and one firing through this proposed centerline pod. Maybe that's the thinking here. On top of that, let's get tactical, shall we say. If we talk about giving firepower to the aircraft, substituting 2 wing-mounted MG151-20s for one centerline-mounted MG151-20, even though it is giving you more performance, might not actually be the best thing to do for 2 reasons. First, you lose firepower, and usually when you attack a bomber, you get 1 pass, and you just need to hammer out as much lead as those guns will give you and hope that as many rounds as possible connect with the enemy aircraft. 2 guns give you more chances than 1 gun. Second, the study compares 1 centerline pod to 3 pods. And this leaves the question, what is the performance differential between 1 pod to 2? For this we go to a file that I did not find in the archives, but that you can also find on kurfürst.org, which is a site that provides some rather good information on the Bf-109. Here we have the performance comparison between the different G-types, the Gustav types of the Bf-109. It is a bit hard to read, but I will draw your attention to the G2R2. This is a recon variant, but the closest thing we have in this list to a clean configuration. Speed at sea level, 523 km per hour. At 6.7 kilometers, it's 652 kilometers an hour. Moving to the G4 with gun pods, 511 kph at sea level, 634 at 6.6 kilometers an hour. So generally, you can expect a performance decrease of about 8 to 18 kilometers per hour between sea level to about 7 kilometers with the wing pods. If we eyeball this, it fits in relatively well with the 8 kilometers you lose at 8 kilometers with a single pod. So you lose another 10 kilometers per hour in total on top of that if you use 2 pods instead of 1. In the end, it is a question about how do you use these planes? How is the average pilot going to perform in them? What are really your priorities? What sort of enemy aircraft are you going to be engaging? What other projects are you working on in terms of planes and armament and of course engines? I think if we put all of this together, then also recognize the fact that here it is a Luftflotte, so one of the air fleets of the German Luftwaffe, demanding these changes, you can start to see the picture of why this didn't happen. The G6 is about to appear. At the same time, it would require some restructuring for logistics and production. And I get sort of the sense from the file that maybe Luftflotte 3 or the people that made this test aren't perhaps fully aware of where the developmental phase of the Bf-109 is taking the aircraft, of course being up-armed now with a 30mm cannon, or simply not fully taking into account that these changes do take some time to appear. And that while it might be easy on the ground to say, well, we want this and this sort of change in our aircraft, that to turn that around into a production change is, once again, way more complicated. Lots of things to talk about, so of course, as always, I'm also going to pass the question off to you. Let me know what you think about all of this. I do hope that you enjoy all these files that I pull out from the archives, plenty of more coming up. So as always, I also want to thank my Patreon and channel members, because it is them that make these videos possible, allow me to go to archives and make this content for all of you. If you enjoy it, please consider supporting the channel with $1 or $2 a month, share the videos, and as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.